Why? Hello and welcome. And it's going to be a bit different video here, but I figure, you know what? I want to talk about Noah's Ark and how people have gotten so carried away with it. And I added a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't even in the story, and how like 90% of the pictures you're used to seeing and the paintings are actually kind of ignoring the original text. Now, I know this is kind of odd for usually a channel where I talk about like hard drives and building a computer, but it's like, you have to be able to read a manual and understand that there's context you may not know. Like, Noah's Ark is from, it's actually a double, well, you know what, I'm not even going to bother with text. Computer, thank you. Brush will work. You know, a little bigger, but we're going from, let's just pretend we have today, and here's the Middle Ages, here's 0 AD, I'm going to go with 0 AD, the other stuff is just kind of rude. And we have, this doesn't need to be perfect, we just need to understand, here's 0 AD, here's the Jewish exile by Babylon, the burning of the library at Jerusalem, here's the story being written down. So we have language A, B, C, D, and E. Why am I listing this as 5 languages? Well, because you have the contemporary language that Noah's Ark would have happened with the people who wrote it, originally lived it, not wrote it, lived it. I'm just going to assume they lived it because by the end of this, there's a way of explaining it that makes it very believable and not harebrained, and brings it back down to reality land. Then you have the period between Noah's Ark and Genesis and the burning of the Great Temple. And in here, there's at least one language. These are clear points in time that I can clearly label, and this is another language that this language was translated into. And then you have, after that, you have another one, as Hebrew continued to evolve and Aramaic began to arrive. And then you have 0 AD, and Aramaic continues to arrive. I know for sure it's somewhere in here, Aramaic, but there is a culture shifting here between languages. These are just broad points in time with changes in how people use languages, the shifting in word meanings. And today we have like English, which means that I'm reading a language that was translated from this, that was translated from this, that was translated from this, that translated for this. This means inherently, when doing Noah's Ark, there's going to be some weird. There's going to be awkward sentences. There's going to be weird word choice. It's going to have a few tensing issues. It's going to be 99% accurate, but some of the sentences are going to be strange. They're correct, but they're going to pick up some peculiarities from being around for more than 2,500 years, at least. I'm going to assume it's a little older than that. And just because you have a lot of flood stories. Now, let's just back this all away. Fine. You don't want me to do it that way? I'll just do it this way. Because then I don't have to, well, now. The next thing we have is the dimensions of Noah's Ark. And this leads to an interesting thing, where we make it this giant building, and it has to be giant. Well, I'm going to let Noah cheat and have iron nails, but I can't really let him cheat and have iron nails. I'm going to go with medieval buildings. Now, I did look up at least quickly anyway, and I've seen a lot. Medieval wooden buildings, about as tall as they get, is about 3 stories tall. And Noah's Ark, well, we're going to start with red, and then we're going to paint it over with pitch, but I'll just or number. So it's about 300 long, and it's 30 high, and it's You know what? Let's just do it down here. It's really long. What really matters is it's really long. It's approximately wide. Comes up here. It comes down here. This is a really bad building. But because trying to fit something that's 30 times longer than it is, or 10 times longer than it's tall, it's not going to work well on my screen. But, and then, fill this in. See all the white blobs from the other. But as you can see, it's kind of a building here. And then there's the first thing we forget. Let's go over here. I want to go to I think the oil brush is more accurate. Pull this up big so it's easy to do. It's covered in pitch. You notice I haven't put a roof on it. Later it said it has a covering. Now, while I'm busy painting this, the word ark is interesting. It roughly, this word used for Noah's Ark is not the same word used for the Ark of the Covenant. It has an emotional meaning of a very safe place for those who are vulnerable. That's the emotional meaning. That's not a literal translation. That's the emotional, what it's trying to instill in you that it's about. And it's, how do I put it? It roughly translates to, I think, it's a wicker basket, a sign that you would put a baby in. And it's the same one as Moses is when he's drawn out of the water, and his mother puts him in the water. And this is where we got the idea of it's a boat. I've checked. It is not the word for ship, and it is not the word for boat. It's baby basket. This is not a boat. Now, a medieval building, that's where we start to think about the whole floating thing, as we think of Noah and the boat. No, there's no boat. I know that's where it's taught. And they skipped this part in all the paintings I've seen, and it probably had... Oh, come on. Come on, hand. Behave. Thank you. Looks less like an oil... Where's the calligraphy thing? I have no idea what this... There you go. Kind of. It had probably some kind of thatched roof. It's a thatched roof, and that's something that we assume it's a wooden roof because we think of wooden roofs. We think of always in the contemporary, the era we live in today. Well, even medieval buildings would have been built with wood pegs. There's no iron in this frame. There's no bronze. Bronze doesn't make very good nails, and nails really weren't readily available until the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, where nails became cheap. And no, I don't know why this is lagging, probably because it's a giant picture, but... And it's not happy with me. Oh, come on, there's one I found yesterday. It was really nice. But... you end up with the... There you go. That's kind of what I was looking for. You end up with... It's turned into this giant thing. And when I looked up medieval buildings... I know, I should have had the pitch go down a little sooner, and it should be taller. Whatever. This is hand-drawn and has to fit, and I'm fighting with a mouse. Which means it's a boring log structure. I mean, it's 350 by 30 by 50. It's probably about 3 stories tall. Cubit used to be the word mother of elbow, oddly enough, what I've done in reading before ChatGPT and all the chatbots ruined everything. And medieval buildings got about 3 stories tall. 30 would mean that roughly each 10 cubits is a story. A story back then, if you include the frame, probably about 8 feet tall. So we're looking at a building that's between 24 to 30 feet tall. Not these grandiose estimates. I'm just going by what wood will do. Medieval buildings, and this is architecture well after Noah. We know it's after Noah because it was written down long before medieval Europe and its wooden buildings. And this isn't the one odd guy in California who couldn't bear the thought of cutting his 21 his ceilings are 21 feet high because that's the length of a redwood log, and he didn't feel like cutting them again. So you're not going to stack 3 of those, and that's still not these overly grandiose, insane measurements. And it's covered in pitch inside and out, which I've just, it's a box with no windows. There is a mention of a window, and the window in the ark is a noonday window. Let's see, what would be it? Well, a noonday window would be at the top. It would be a chimney, basically, or an air hole cover in the middle of the roof. Because for those who have forgotten from and see all the old stuff, but for those who have forgotten, there's this thing called the sun. That lives up here in the sky. And what Noah would be talking about in this window to make it work is something called solar noon, which means it's straight up. It's when the sun is straight up. This is now, I know this isn't a boat. Everyone's used to boat. I grew up with a boat. I made a Lego boat. It's fine. So we're up here, and now we have this box with a hole in the roof. A covered hole. It's an air vent. No mention of how many rooms. The animals actually self-selected, because Noah's told to build the ark, not round up animals. He's told to get the food for the animals, but the animals will show up. And even today, if you've seen some of the videos of deer, birds, squirrels moving in with people in a wildfire, it's getting dangerous to move into people's buildings. They move into trucks. Cats adopting people. That's what it is. It's some animals just know they need to go there. And those are, they know they need to go and move into the ark, so they move into the ark with Noah. And this does bring into an interesting question of Noah's age, which was probably about 46 years old. That's what happens when you divide 600 by 13. The reason I use the number 13 is, while that's not actually the number of lunar cycles in a year, it's close enough. It would mean his age would vary between 46 to about 52 years old. And then explain the lack of grandchildren. Because there's just his sons. There's no grandchildren, and yet he's 600 years old. If he was actually 600 years old, as in solar 600 years old, not lunar 600 years old, he would be with grandchildren. This building would have thousands of people moving in. It would be, because it's exponential. If you just assume that even he had only 2 sons, and each one of them, if you only had 2 children and all of them had 2 children, it's an exponential. If you throw in the number his children had, it's cubed, and it's still exponential. They're not fitting in this building. So, no. Now, this is what the ark looks like. And you're like, but how is that going to survive a flood? Also, the shape, I know this is basically a box and really crude and drawn with a mouse. Oh, the person has very bad hands for using a mouse for art anymore, but and I put it. It's, we get carried away, and that's fine. Another one, getting carried away, it's what you do to get yourself back into reality. So we have, like, clean up the sky a bit. So we have nice clean sky instead of horror. Now, so that window in English, and I'm also using King James because it was a very doing its best to be politically agnostic, literal translation. which means that it will have a few words that are mistranslated, like jackal into... I know this is a bit disorganized, that's fine. Jackal is usually translated, but it means those who howl in the wilderness. And that's an honest... It's a literal translation of an animal that also happens to be sentence phrase. It's a context thing. It's not a big deal. Doesn't change meaning the sentence too much. Well, it changes the meaning quite a bit where it's used, but you end up with some odd moments like that. But for the most part, it's pretty accurate. Now, I need to reset paint, and I'll see you back in a second. Okay, now we have a clean palette to start all over again. Now, how can we make... First, the waters came up and under the earth and came around it. Now, as someone who's been in a flooded house that was in floodwaters and has experienced some floods, this is a bit of a different experience to me. And what you can have... Let's see how well I can do this. It's kind of hard to... I've been trying to do this picture for a while, but... What you have is you have your normal ground level. And you have where... Oh, let's go with a nice color for this. And you have where water normally is, and you're used to ground level being fairly high up, and the water isn't near you. And it's... No, it's down here. It's nice. It's behaving. There's a nearby river or something. You live nearby. A lake that never floods. You know. And what happens is, oh, here comes that big rainstorm. Everything's underwater. Except for like a few high spots that are up here. You know, they're above the floodplain. And so they don't get swamped. So they're up here. So what can happen with Noah's Ark, and this would make sense, you want the building covered in pitch so that, other than it's kind of silly if you think about it, you just built a giant fire hazard. That's why there's no model for this covered in pitch. One, it'd be sticky and gooey, and two, it'd be a fire hazard, and I'm not making a fire hazard. So this guy is making a fire hazard in the middle of probably a grassy plain, you know, a nice... You know, I have the grass everywhere. It's underwater now. You know, everything was great. And now, because, well, it's just a different shade of brown. Because up here, you know, your ark's up here. Make it a little less dingy. Actually, it kind of probably looks something like this. And so you have, you know, you're living up here in your little tar shack with its thatch roof. Yeah, really exciting here. But the thing is, can you imagine, like, there's mountains back here. You know, you got all your mountains, and they're, like, gone. All the grass you're seeing is underwater. So what could cause this? Well, let's see if I can find the right brush to make this work. See, you can have the whole world covered, and the mountains were covered. If any of you have been out in a really heavy rainstorm, have probably noticed. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, you can kind of see my outline, my impressionist mountains here. This is still covered. This is still covering the mountains in water. It's called rain. It's another way of doing it, and this doesn't change the original text. It's just a different way of viewing the text. So we have, oh, a flash flood event, and all this rain, and it's horrible, and it's scary, and you're hearing the water outside. Now, the ark, the water came up to the ark. I have read so many different measurements of this water, depending on the translation. We know water was below the ark. Okay. And so we have all this rain, and oh, look, these mountains just disappear into the rain while the flood comes up and fills the plain. Ew, this is no longer weird. We're back into very easily achieved reality because a man in his 50s with his sons could easily have built a wood building, covered it in pine or asphalt pitch, depending on the translation, doesn't really matter, covered it in pitch inside and out. The critters that are the animals that are going to live around in the area are going to move in when the floodwaters show up. And you may notice I didn't put any windows in it except for the one on the top. Well, you notice something. See all this flood? You can hear what's going on, but they don't really know when the water ends. You just know it rained, and you know when it stopped raining, but you can't see this. Why? This leads to the end where it's like he sends out a raven and the water just disappeared for some reason. But how does he know that the water disappeared with the raven? Why suddenly we have something else instead of just the floodwaters receded? I don't know. That's getting into some more technical depth than this really is. We're just turning this back into reality, man. Now, we have a flash flood. You can't see what's going on. God has sealed them in. They're safe. The problem is, how do you find out that the water disappeared? Well, man, this is so big, paint's not happy. How do you know? Well, there's no window on the sides. So, we let out our... You know what? I'm going to make it so we can actually see these things. Look. Maybe with a little better contrast. But, he lets out a raven. I'm just going to use the typical child upside down WV birds, but, and it doesn't come back. Now, eventually, he sends out, and that bird doesn't come back, and then he sends out a dove, and the dove goes off and flies around and comes back. And rests his hand because Noah is, well, for the sake of color contrast, he's sticking his arm out. Let me get this big enough. You can actually, he's got his hand sticking out here, out of the hole in the roof. We're just going to make him a shadow puppet because that's easier than whatever. He's going to stick his hand out of the hole in the ark. And the ark needs light, need air, and top of the roof, it makes sense. So he pops a hole in the roof, or the covering, or pops the cover up the noonday window because the sun's up here in the sky. Up here, noontime sun. That's kind of an interestingly weird sun. Let's fix that. I can do better than that. That's the regular brush should work. But, we have the noon sun, which I should move above it so you can tell better what I'm talking about. Noontime sun, noontime window. That means you can see the sun at noon. The solar noon, not your clock noon. Time zones are for trains and airplanes and making computers work. The sun doesn't care. Sun existed before them. That's where we get the word noon, basically, from someone. And, well, you can have some erosion down here. That leads us to another word that has, if you've been around, you've ever heard of the Tar Pits, the temple at Angkor Temple. Double copies that happen between language shifts. Mount Ararat is the mountain, or the mountain holy place, high place. See a problem with this? It's a double translation, at least in the English. Which means that it's either, the thing is, high place and mountain, they came to rest. This is where you can end up, they rested at or came to rest at. You can end up with little shifts like that through 5 different languages, as in cultures like Americans and the UK and Australians, New Zealanders, Filipinos, even Texans, and Californicos, or Californians, or Oregonians, and Washingtonians, and I've forgotten the names of other states, don't all quite speak the same dialect of English. Kind of like the youth and their grandparents don't quite speak the same English. The vernacular has shifted ever so slightly and tends to So we're gonna be, maybe they rested at. We know that they were at a place that now became a high place. Well, it's interesting is that what I have read is that the Noah's Ark is the same overall dimensions as the Great Temple. But there's no mention of a hull, and it's still remarkable. I mean, now that this is back in Reality Land, it's like, how do you know where to put it? I mean, knowing to build a fire hazard that the neighbors are going to mock you for in the middle of a place that's never flooded, and then the flood comes and you're fine and everyone else is gone. Now, if someone would tell me it was a submarine, maybe, and it says in the end he removed the covering, which says it's probably a straw covering. It's probably with thatch roof, like blobby thatch roof. But yeah, you can see a little better here how that green is obscured by the blue of the rain. You know, it's, and then the whole world's covered, and you don't have to have weird irrational phenomena happen. It's just called really heavy rainfall, which happens. Hurricanes happen, typhoons happen, rain bursts happen, thunderstorms happen. And it's going to be a long one. You can have log jams that jam up the river, and you end up with a pond under these guys in like a river canyon. Because we don't know where this is. We don't know what the terrain is. We know is that the world got covered with water. The ark didn't get underwater. People didn't drown that were in the ark, or the animals, and that Noah couldn't see what was going on because he had to send a bird out to go find an olive tree. You know, it's in my terrible olive tree, but you know, when you have to send a creature out to, and I know this is not really an olive tree, but when you have to send a bird out to figure out that these trees aren't underwater anymore, you don't have a window. I don't know where this clear story business came from, because if you had a clear story, you know, I just need to tidy this up a bit, but if you had a clear story, he wouldn't need to send a bird. This, he just reaches his hand out through the roof, you know, stands on whatever. And of course, you'd want to pitch the inside because it's going to be rather nasty in there. I know the birds don't care. People are going to be relieving themselves in there, obviously, because you're not going to hold it for 40 days. You'd be long expired if you held it for 40 days. Or any long period of time, like a week. You'd still be gone. Tops. So we got Tycho Brahe not using the restroom because it was rude at a dinner party. Died of a ruptured bladder. Really disgusting. So we know that they had to use the facility somewhere in here. How that worked, I have no idea. I've heard it, depending on which version I found, because I know there are more than one version of the King James. But because it was cleaned up about 1790. They did another spelling fix. But, you know, when you have to send a bird out to figure out, you know, a lovely little dove was going to be a white blob, to go find out that the water's gone, and then you have to cut your way out, yeah. Now this is very believable. It's still amazing, though. Think about it. You're living in this nice plain, or wherever you're living, I'm going to bet, you know, next near a river or something, or a dry creek bed, and everything's great. World's kind of violent. World's becoming violent. Things are getting tense. And you're told to go build a house, and then covered in tar with no windows. Build this giant fire hazard of a building. And what? I mean, this is crazy. If you think about it, just following the definition, it's still somewhat crazy, because you're being told to go build a fire hazard on a high spot. I'm going to add the high spot, because if it's a flash flood, you have to build on the high spot so it doesn't get washed away. And it also explains why they had no idea when the water had went away, because people are like, well, it came to rest. Well, are you sure they didn't just come to rest at what a place that became known as the high place, and through 5 translations, a few word tenses, a little bit got garbled? Because there was the North and the South Kingdom and all kinds of stuff. The language changed a lot since this was originally occurred. So there's going to be a few issues that are maybe they're just grammatical rather than, oh yeah, well, what would reality look like? This is my question here. It's a nice house, decent house, covered in tar on a high spot in a place prone to flash flooding, probably about every 100 years, maybe. Ends up hit with a flash flood, could be an ice age building, because Noah's Ark is so far back that you're not building. There's no steel hull bolts, people. There's no life rafts with inflatables. The Viking longships aren't even that big, and there's not even a multi-story building. They're a one-story building, and they said the cheat when they built one recently, because the Viking longship only kind of goes about 90% the length of this, maybe. And that was a major architectural shipbuilding revolution in the Middle Ages and Dark Ages, was the Viking longship, and that's a pretty big boat. And you had triremes, and yeah, those are getting up there, but which is 3 stories tall, but you're not supporting animals, and that's a source ship, so there's no food stores, no water, and a handful of Marines, and that's about it. It has to be rowed, and there's no roof on it, really. There's a top deck, but yeah. So, what was Noah's Ark? Well, his safe house, probably on a high spot in a floodplain that he had to send birds out because who'd want to see the horrors that happen? I don't like looking at flood footage on the news. I don't know about anyone else. I don't. So it's like, save him from watching the horrors going on outside. It also plays very well later into you don't want to see irate, all this string God march by, which also works with that because there's no windows. You're behind a curtain, this time a pitched wall and a wood covered pitch. I mean, we talk about the gopher wood thing. In the end of the day, does it really matter what wood it's made out of as long as it's a reliable wood? You know, today we just it's like, it's wood. Okay, so it's a wood building. That's really all that matters. You could go argue over what gopher meant forever. I don't know. For all I know, it meant bogwood, which would explain why they were in a floodplain. Is that what it is? I have no idea. I wasn't the guy who originally lived through it, or any of the people that passed it on before me. I do know that this is still a fantastical story, and humans really like to make mega projects. And what if it wasn't a mega project? And what made it amazing was people survived a very dangerous situation with guidance from God. And obviously Noah did not have a floppy drive to plug in boat building from the modern era, and he didn't have access to modern shipbuilding techniques or anything. He had wood and definitely stone tools and wooden pegs for fasteners, because those were still fairly common until about 400 years ago for sure. Even a lot of your houses and fences built during the Civil War period had, US 1860s still would have used a lot of wood pegs. Fences they figured out to build without using anything. They just put notches in it. Your log cabins you see don't have, they might have some pins for the roof joists because iron was expensive. And this is much more recent, so I can safely assume this is a wooden building with wooden fasteners, given its size. And later he goes on to be a vintner, and that leads to a whole bunch of other weirdness in language transmission. But I'd figure I'd just kind of make it a little more plausible and still talk about how crazy it still was. And crazy as in, wow, that worked out and it doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't think about it outside of the box thinking, because building a fire hazard building with a straw roof, boy, that's a tinder fire waiting to go. If it had a thatch roof on top of pitch, gee, yeah, you're expecting a rainstorm with that. Otherwise, that thing is going to be dangerous. It means you're eating nothing but pre-cooked food, which would make sense. And then, of course, you have rainbows, which I'm going to leave out because people are going to argue over it. But still, that's a humble dwelling was where everyone survived. We like that grandiose. We have to be bigger. We have to be better. Doesn't mean we don't need to strive to be better. But there does come a point of self-deification, and I think we kind of do that a bit. We slip into that. And this is back down to a very remarkable story of surviving a flood that's now within the very reasonable means of reality of a flash flood. Those happen. We see them in the news. You can look them up. You can look up what all those other things are, like hurricanes and typhoons and rain bursts or thunder bursts, cloud bursts. Correct phrase, crowd bursts, not any of the other ones. Well, typhoon and hurricanes are real. Major storm fronts, those are real. Olive trees are real. Doves are real. Ravens are real. Houses are real. You know, this makes it back into something you can touch, feel, smell. You know, you hear the wind blowing past it, back into more of a grounded reality. And still extremely remarkable and amazing. Because obviously, if you create a world and you're the one that sets all the boundaries, you probably should be obeying said boundaries. And that would make a lot of sense. This is working within the rules of the universe that we know of. And if you're like me, believe God created the universe, he's going to work with the rules there. He's not going to cheat them. Why? Because that's dishonest, and he's not dishonest. So, yeah. This is now completely real. What was the real Noah's Ark? A house with probably a thatch roof covered in tar. And I know we like our boats and have it sailing all over the place. I have no idea where that started. I tried looking. I could not find where it suddenly became a boat. Except this is very believable now. I mean, I like this, and it's still remarkable and very much a fire hazard, which would explain why it would seem absolutely preposterous. Why would you build a fire hazard house? I don't know. But anyway. How does this add to tech? Well, so you watched me in that BIOS video trying to find out about, well, BIOS, reading the BIOSes and looking at M.2s. It was very easy to get caught up in hype. And yet I went and looked at the BIOSes and was like, oh yeah, here's a PCIe bug. They listed it. It's just here. We just didn't feel like looking at the website because, as you noticed, 3 out of 5 didn't have anything. The other 2 were more specific. And here I'm just pointing out specific details. Specific details. The water came up. The water came down from the heavens, the sky. Specific details: an olive tree, a dove, a raven, the holes in the roof, a window in the roof, an air vent. The covering was removed. It's a tarred building. These are specifics, specifics, specifics. You have to move. You have to be very careful with stuff like anything you read. And it's part of, how do I pull out what are the factual statements in it? Noah is commanded. That's a fact. This is a wood building. Do we really know what kind? No. Does it really matter? Not really. If you're stacking and making a log cabin, basically, and cover it in pine pitch, it's not that hard to do. And now we're in reality. And the structural integrity of the wood is more of a salient thing. Do we know how many rooms in it? Nope. It just says put rooms in it. It doesn't say, well, put rooms in it. Do we know? Nope. Do we know that the word noontime window got chopped to just window? Yep. And a thatch roof actually breathes pretty well. So the ventilation with a thatch roof wouldn't be an issue because it's not airtight. It's rainproof, but it breathes. So they wouldn't, plenty of air. And probably more than one noontime window. It's obviously a rectangle and not a circle. And it's in the era of, well, small square houses and mud brick and wattle and daub. And this is not wattle and daub. And wattle daub is used very, very long time. Very effective, but not very water resistant. Now, someone wanted to tell me he built a cofferdam or something, a building that's meant to be submerged, yeah, sure. I'd have no problem with that. Because this is a waterproof building with no openings on the outside, really, except for the roof. So it's, if someone wanted to tell me about how it was, the water came up to it, yeah, sure. But this boat thing, no. And this is from thousands of years of archaeology. Noah is not going to magically, out of the blue, invent a ship that's bigger than you can build with wood at the time, the tools he had. He has no access to steel. He has no access to iron. And some of you guys have, I've seen some people try to guess at the size of it, and it's bigger than a major wooden battleship on the British Navy of the high age of sail. It's not happening, guys. It's not happening. This is working with the real laws of physics. We need to be absolutely amazed by simple solutions that achieve so much, and how remarkable the simple, wonderful things in life are. Oh, I'd forgotten olive trees live on rocky outcrops. Okay. Yeah, Greece tends to do cuttings or grafting of domesticated trees on wild rootstock. And a lot of them live in crags, and they're very drought-resistant trees. So it actually tells you a lot about where they were. It's very dry. At least fairly dry for olives to grow. Whether clay, rocky soil, which would allude to a lot of things, to be honest. I'm not quite sure where, and they live a long time, too. So we do know the soil type in the area was conducive to olive trees. There's another fact. There's a few facts you can extrapolate. It's not hard to go, well, there's an olive branch. Well, that means you have the soil for an olive tree. Do I really know that was originally an olive tree? No idea. I do know it's wooden building. Probably with the thatch or a covering. Roof, covering, why is it changing? Obviously not intended to be lived in for a very long time. And you probably wouldn't want to go back there. And I wouldn't blame anyone for wanting to be drunk after living through that and just kind of forget the horror, because there'd be a horror aspect to this. We get caught up in it's partially why there's no windows to cut down on the horror, because you don't want to see a flash flood in action outside of your safe home. You want to be as oblivious as possible, and hopefully the animals help by making a lot of annoying racket. I doubt it. I don't know. Wasn't there. But a house above a floodplain that no one knew where it was, like when Fukushima was hit, the Fukushima tsunami hit, the previous tsunami was around 640, also at the U.S. West Coast. Japan had gone out and marked where that tsunami had hit, because it's the biggest one they'd ever seen, so they put on those markers and made it so you couldn't build houses or castles or living structures, but you could farm, you could fish, you could do timber. But above that line, you could build. Below it, no buildings. Except for docks. Obviously, docks and ships get a bit of exemption here, but you couldn't live down there, so that next time would happen, and there was the Fukushima tsunami came, and everyone who was still above those rocks was fine. They'd marked it, early zoning, saying, hey, this land can be used for this, and this land needs to be used for this because of the dangers that we know of now. And, well, a lot of people listen and live off those rocks, and this is God telling Noah, build up here, build this house. I assume maybe he told him where, even though that's not in the story. He kind of might need some help, or had a good idea. It was like the high spot. I should build it on the high spot. It's no holy place, where they survived, because that's where God told them to go. So now it's a holy place. That makes sense. Doesn't have to be outside of. They don't need giant spaceship wood things. No, it can just be a house covered in tar with a thatch roof and an olive trees nearby. Oh, textual analysis is very tricky, and fortunately, I don't have all the technical terms, but then I didn't want to get dragged into a lot of the other stuff they got dragged into, and I was just wanting to share it of. I realized there was a way of explaining it that's less epic movie, but still just as amazing. If not, in some ways, more amazing that you managed to build it in the right spot, not to get, well, washed away. And survive because you listen. Well, if you guys don't mind that side trip, and I will see you guys next time.